Hello, I'm Benjamin Fry, and today we're going to talk about boundaries, and particularly how they're not something you get somebody else to do for you. So throughout this series, we've been building an idea of an individual's nervous system as something that is inherently dysregulated if they've been unable to finish all of their organic responses to threat throughout all the threats in their life. And the problem with a dysregulated nervous system is it tends to either react too much or too little, either overreact or underreact to life stimuluses. There's a third possibility, which is the perfect reaction, which we call the Goldilocks reaction, but that is harder to find. So a dysregulation means that we're either adding to our reaction to something all the unfinished business from before, or we're so overwhelmed by all the unfinished business from before that actually we can't have any reaction at all. We can think about this as a kind of visual model. So if you think about, here's my dysregulated nervous system, it's like a bundle of unfinished business in the middle of me. Life comes at it in what we often call triggers. And then we have a reaction that's a combination of the trigger plus the unfinished business. And it can be like a huge reaction, or it could be just a completely closing in, like a trapping of all the energy in, say, like a black box around the problem. So today I want to talk about what we can do to make either of those reactions, either the explosion or the frozen reaction, look a little bit more like the Goldilocks reaction, which would be, let's say I get a trigger that's a 3 out of 10, I have a reaction that's a 3 out of 10. Not a 9 out of 10, not a 0 out of 10, but a 3 out of 10. So even if we think about this as some kind of weird mathematical problem, you can think, well, here's this enormous piece of energy that's waiting to explode. And here's life just coming in at it all the time. You have triggers which are from 1 out of 10 to 10 out of 10. It's happening all the time. And what we want to try and do is make a combination of the trigger plus the unexploded bomb that leads to a reaction that's just right, that looks like a Goldilocks reaction. It may be that we still have a dysregulated nervous system. We haven't yet been able to finish all of our unfinished reactions to earlier threats, but nonetheless, it might be possible to find a way to get closer to what looks like more functional behavior than to overreact or underreact. And there's one important thing to help you do that. So if you can imagine this input that's coming at you, this trigger that's coming at you is 3 out of 10, what if you could reduce it? What if you could make it 2 out of 10 or 1 out of 10 or 0.1 out of 10? Then you might find that it could hit your baggage, hit your unfinished business, and your reaction might be, say, I don't know, a 6 out of 10 or a 5 out of 10 or maybe even a 3 out of 10. And so somehow miraculously, just by dialing down the impact of the trigger, you could find yourself reacting just right to the kind of stimulus you have in real life. So then you've got to ask, well, what would that look like? What would it look like to reduce the triggers that you have in your life? Well, first of all, you have to identify the triggers. And the way to do that is by noticing your reactions. So anything that I overreact to or underreact to, by definition, I'm being triggered. So that tells me what my triggers are. It's another reason why we have to get really close to our physiology, really into our bodies, really understand what's going on inside, so we can begin to notice when we're triggered. And when we notice when we're triggered, we notice that there's been a trigger by definition. The next thing we can do is start to think about how could we reduce those triggers. And this is where this idea of boundaries comes in. Boundaries is a word that's been around forever. It's very popular in addiction care, behavioral health care. But it's often, I think, misapplied or misunderstood or misused. One of the things I don't like to hear is when people explain their problems by saying that somebody else has failed their own boundaries, if that makes any sense. What I'm trying to advocate here is that my boundaries are born out of an awareness of my nervous system. So I begin to become aware of when my nervous system is overwhelmed, when my nervous system is overreacting or underreacting. That tells me when I'm being triggered, and that tells me what I need to do to reduce my triggers. And that's my boundary. So, for example, it might be that when people raise their voices around me, maybe I grew up in a house with a very shouty, violent father, and that therefore I have a lot of unfinished business around that. And so I become triggered when someone raises their voice at me. So let's say you're in a work environment and it's a slightly stressful meeting and somebody's getting a bit het up. I might either then start shouting back, or I might shut down and not contribute again. And that tells me that I've learned that there's something going on for me there other than just what's going on in the room. So then you ask, well, what's the boundary to that? How do you stop people shouting in your environment? One very easy way, obviously, is just to ask people not to do it. And there are a number of ways of asking, which also increases the complexity. You could say to someone, hey, why are you such a jerk shouting all the time? Stop shouting. Shouting's not a good idea. Or you could say, look, I find the way I am as an individual is that when people are shouting around me, it really brings out the worst in me. So I'd recommend you don't do it. Or you could get really vulnerable and say, look, I grew up in a very aggressive household. And so when I'm around people shouting, I have a disproportionate reaction. I find it very difficult. These are all different ways to go, but the more that you blame it on the other person and the less that you open up a window into your own experience, I think the less functional it is, and the less likely it is to be heard on the other side. You have to balance that against how vulnerable and how open you want to be with the person you're talking to. But the key point here is that whatever the boundary is, it's my boundary to manage, because it's my nervous system that's the problem. The trigger isn't the problem. The baggage, my baggage, is the problem. And it's being shown up by the trigger, but it wasn't created by the trigger. So I can't say to people that the problem here is that you're not listening to me and you're still shouting at me. I've got to say to myself, I'm the problem here, because people are still shouting at me, therefore I haven't listened to me, because what should I be doing? I should be getting myself out of that room. The important thing is that I give myself permission to manage my own boundaries. And that's the opposite usually of what happened when the original problem was created, often in childhood, often in situations where we neither had any control nor we had the option to rescue ourselves by getting out of there. So in any situation where, for example, someone's shouting at me, I always have the option to just walk out of the room. And that surprises people because they feel like the job of boundaries is to get someone else to do things for them or to them that makes their life easier. But the responsibility of my nervous system is for me to take steps to put it in a place that's safer for it. And that's the key point. So boundaries are about, first of all, observing the nervous system, noticing when it's over or under reacting, associating that with a trigger, and then becoming clear with myself what it would take to reduce that trigger so I could feel safer. Then I have a whole nother problem, which is how to communicate that to other people, if at all, and what to do for myself if that doesn't change things for the better. But that's the key point. So my boundaries in many respects is no one's business but mine, and it's my job to maintain them because I'm the one that is responsible for ensuring I'm in an environment which is most healthy for my particular constellation of unfinished business in my nervous system. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you'd like to know more about the issues around boundaries and more about the diagrams that go with them, please have a look at the resources at theinvisiblelion.com where you can see more about the book too.